For more on the ongoing U.S. war in Afghanistan, the longest-running war in American history, we're joined now here in New York by author Tom Engelhardt. He's the creator and editor of the website TomDispatch.com. His latest book is called The American Way of War, How Bush's Wars Become Obama's. His latest post on Tom Dispatch is called Call the Politburo. We're in trouble entering the Soviet era in America. What do you mean? Welcome to Democracy Now!, Tom.
What I mean is that in the Cold War, which we've largely forgotten at this point, the Soviet leaders made a kind of a basic miscalculation. They mistook military power for global power. They poured all their money functionally into their military. They got stuck in Afghanistan, very much like us, for 10 years. In the meantime, their budget deficits were going up. They were growing, their indebtedness to other countries was growing. Their infrastructure was beginning to crumble. This very society they had built was beginning to crumble. And when the Red Army came out of Afghanistan, it limped out in 1989 after a decade. It basically returned to a country that didn't exist because within 2 years, the Soviet Union collapsed. In Washington, this caught everybody by surprise. Everybody expected the Cold War to go on and on. When American leaders saw this happen, they declared victory. The world was without an enemy at this point. And they, in one of the more striking decisions, I think, that's been made in many, many years, they decided then to follow the Soviet path. And they began, and they put the so-called peace dividend in a ditch. And they began to pour money, successive administrations, as we know, up through the Bush administration into today, into the American military while budget deficits rose, indebtedness rose, infrastructure crumbled, and the society began to, began to weaken. Now, the United States is not the Soviet Union. It was always by far the more powerful country, and it isn't today the Soviet Union in 1989 or 1991. But it is striking that our leaders, in declaring victory, decided to go down, in essence, the Soviet path, which was the path to implosion.
You spend quite a bit of time on the book in one chapter talking about the language of war and how the American media portrayed Muslim resistance fighters in other wars, initially in the first war in Afghanistan against the Soviets and in Chechnya as well. Could you talk about the language of war?
Well, if you go back in the 1980s, of course, we were supporting many of the very people we're now fighting. And at that point, they were not Muslim extremist whatevers. They weren't Islamic totalitarians. They were, well, the president said it at the time. That was President Reagan. He called them freedom fighters. And when you look at the language in the press for these very same people doing many of the very same things, it just happened to be against the Soviets. Car bombs, camel bombs, bike bombs, suicide attacks, so on and so forth. And this included Osama bin Laden and so on and so forth. They were portrayed as resistance fighters. You would never see the word resistance fighter put with the Taliban. Nor, to give you an example, in the Iraq War, it was very interesting. The phrase that the military often used for those they were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan is they referred to them as anti-Iraqi forces or anti-Afghan forces, as if they were fine. And of course, nobody would refer to us as anti-Iraqi forces or foreign forces or anything of the sort. I mean, there's a whole language that goes with American-style war. To give you just a simple example, and you hear it relatively often, when things start to go badly, American officials, Robert Gates said it relatively recently, say, let's put an Afghan face on the war. And this is just a commonplace thing, and it means let's get an Afghan out front. But if you think about that phrase for a minute, an Afghan face is, of course, a mask over really an American war. And often the words that they use, the images that they use, are very telling, if you just look barely under them, about what they think about who's actually running what war. I mean, you can really see in our language that we feel this is ours, it should be ours, it's our war. I mean, the Afghans are ancillary to the war we're fighting.
How do you propose pulling out? How do you propose Obama get out?
Well, let me say as a start that one of the problems with answering a question like this is, basically, we've never tried it. I mean, in other words, it's like talking about peace. All the money goes into war. So and in addition, as you try to get out, as was true in Vietnam for years, future fantasies are put forward. You know, there's going to be a bloodbath, terrible things will happen. We don't know what actually will happen in Afghanistan. If we were to pull out, we know what's happening now, and it's quite terrible, and it's actually devolving. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable whether you, you could simply announce a reasonable withdrawal schedule, and pull out American troops. You could offer money. We really don't know. I think it's very unlikely, for instance, that the Taliban would simply take over the country. They didn't the last time. They might get part of the country, but not all of it. We really don't know what would happen. We just know that this will otherwise be a trillion-dollar war, which, like the Soviet war, will go on forever and ever. I mean, the Soviets, from about 1986 on, for about the last 3 or 4 years, they wanted to get out. The Soviet leadership, you look at their documents, they want to get out, but they can't muster the will. They keep worrying, will Afghanistan be stable, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on for years. And the problem isn't how will we get out of Afghanistan, but when Obama decides he wants to, it's going to be difficult.
And this most recent announcement about the vast mineral wealth in Afghanistan, especially the timing of it, as the war is actually not progressing as well as the Obama administration had hoped. Is it your sense that this was more sort of rallying the corporate and financial elites of the world to take more renewed interest in supporting the U.S. effort?
I'm not convinced it's going to have that effect, actually. First of all, as you can see from the Times today, the Times had a piece on it today, and as was true with Iraq, it's very hard to get these big Western mining companies to come into a situation where, you know, the lithium that they're talking about is basically under lands that basically are Taliban controlled right now. They don't want to send their people in there. The people who might come in are the Chinese, maybe, who would be willing to take more risks, or various state mining interests that we wouldn't be interested in. So I'm not sure this is a great benefit in that sense. Secondly, you know, to get in a country with almost no infrastructure and no mining infrastructure, to get anything around there, I mean, I'm sure you're talking you're not talking about now. You're not talking about something striking that's going to happen now. I think, yeah, I mean, it was a kind of a good news story at a bad news time, and it is significant that there's all this stuff under Afghanistan which was known.
It's not as if it wasn't known, and the question is why it's being raised as a story now, if not to justify the U.S.'s continued presence, that maybe the U.S. can get these natural resources.
Let's point out that it was known by the Russians. You know, in the Russian war, the Russians knew this. I mean, I'm struck by one small thing. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russian leader who did finally get them out, his term for Afghanistan was the bleeding wound. Our Afghan war commander recently referred to his kind of pet offensive in the small southern area of Marja, where they threw in 15,000 troops in the spring, declared it a victory, and now find out that things are not going well. He's called it a bleeding ulcer. There is kind of an eerie parallel there, and it reminds us that both countries will now have been in a war in Afghanistan, a place known as the graveyard of empires, for a decade.
You talk about finally garrisoning of the planet.
Yes. Well, The American Way of War, which is the title of my book, is based on something that in the United States we have basically no interest in. Unless a base closes in the United States, and then there's an enormous uproar, a military base, we really don't think much about our basing policy around the world. And yet,
10 seconds.
And yet we have maybe up to 1,200 bases, depending on what you're counting, maybe even more, around the world. We basically garrison the planet. Washington is a war capital. We are in a state of war. We don't know it.
Talk about McChrystal's comments and what's happening in Afghanistan.
Yes, the reality of modern war from the early 20th century on is that what we call collateral damage has increasingly become the central damage of the war. Collateral damage means damage to civilians. But as war has progressed into our time, you could really say that the soldiers, increasingly on either side, are the collateral damage, and increasingly the civilians are the central damage of any war. We can't count. I mean, we have no idea, despite the counts that you see of actual Afghan deaths, for instance. I mean, who knows what's happening in small villages we haven't heard about.